There are truths carved in stone, sung in temples, and whispered through centuries that no textbook dares to teach. One such truth stretches far beyond Africa. It reaches across oceans, deserts, and mountains, all the way to the Indian subcontinent. Walk into the ancient temples of Tamil Nadu. Step inside the frescoed walls of Ajanta and Ellora. Peer into the carvings at shrines dedicated to Kali, Krishna, and Shiva. Look closely. Really look. You'll see gods with black skin, gods with dreadlocked hair, broad noses, full lips, faces that echo Africa, not metaphorically, not artistically, but literally, in skin, in bone, in spirit. And yet, when historians speak, they whisper carefully, cautiously. They avoid the question, why do Indian gods look African? This is not a rhetorical flourish. This is an archaeological, anthropological, and historical reality. The evidence is everywhere, etched in stone, preserved in scrolls, painted in murals, remembered in song, and the first Europeans to witness it didn't invent it, nor misinterpret it for political gain. They documented it because it startled them. In 1288, the Venetian explorer Marco Polo visited the Pandan kingdom in South India. Polo, a man with no agenda to glorify Africa, recorded what he saw with precision. His observations defy the racial hierarchies Europe would later impose. He wrote, "The darkest man here is the most highly esteemed and considered better than the others who are not so dark." He continued, "In very truth, these people portray and depict their gods and their idols black and their devils white as snow. For they say that God and all the saints are black and the devils are all white. That is why they portray them as I have described." Pause for a moment. A 13th century European, walking through India, observing society and its spiritual world, confirms that blackness was not only respected, it was sacred, it was divine, it was encoded in philosophy, in ritual, and in the very aesthetics of worship. The gods were not merely dark-skinned representations, they were African in every meaningful aspect, dreadlocked, broad-featured, majestic. How did this happen? How did Africa leave its fingerprint on the subcontinent of India? The answer begins with migration, maritime trade, and intimate cross-continental exchange. Historian Dr. Clyde Winters describes Ethiopians as rulers, traders, and spiritual leaders who influenced early Indian civilizations. Known as the Naga, these African people were credited with creating Sanskrit. Ancient Dravidian literature, dating back to 500 BCE, references the Naga not as myth, but as powerful, black dreadlocked figures, guardians of knowledge, founders of mystical systems, and transmitters of sacred wisdom. According to Dr. Winters, even the legends of India revere the black race that laid the foundation of their civilization. The holiest books of India affirm that enlightenment came from Ethiopia. The first god of India is a dreadlocked black man called Shiva. Shiva, the destroyer, transformer, the supreme deity of the Hindu Trinity, is often depicted with dark blue or black skin, dreadlocks piled high, a drum in one hand, a cobra around his neck. Who does this remind you of? Some researchers see him as a cultural twin of African gods like Aun or Shango. His dance mirrors the Yoruba Oisha of thunder. His meditation mirrors Nile Valley priests. The iconography is too precise, too specific to be coincidence, and Shiva is not alone. Krishna, often referred to as the Dark One, is depicted with midnight blue skin and curly hair. Kali, the fierce mother goddess, is jet black, adorned with a necklace of heads, a visual motif common in African spiritual traditions across Congo and Dahomey. These deities are African in form, African in essence, African in memory. Europeans later tried to erase this. Colonizers who painted history as a story of white supremacy ignored the African deed. Fingerprints embedded in Indian religion and philosophy. But the evidence is stubborn. It survives in marble, sandstone, murals, and ritual. It survives in the oral memory of priests, in the chants that echo through temples at dawn, in the living presence of black gods still worshipped today. Even Portuguese travelers recorded the African presence centuries later. Armando Cortazzo, in the 16th century, described Ethiopian governors in Bengal as greatly esteemed, serving kings as warriors and lords. Africans in India were not marginal, they were central. They were royalty, generals, and spiritual authorities. Their influence shaped governance, philosophy, religion, and culture. This is why the gods of India look African, because blackness was revered, encoded into the highest spiritual ideals, immortalized in art, and transmitted across generations. It is not accident. It is not metaphor. It is truth, and it forces us to rethink history, not as a static chronology of events, but as a tapestry of global connection, of African influence, of spiritual and cultural memory that spans continents. The gods in Indian temples are not merely decorative, they are statements, they are archives, they are living proof of a connection between Africa and Asia older than colonial maps, older than Europe's rewritten histories. They are African, and they are divine. In the next chunk, we will explore the specific journeys of African navigators, warriors, and scholars into India, tracing their impact on philosophy, governance, and spiritual practice, and showing how these interactions shape the deities still worshipped today. To understand how Africa left its imprint on India, we must follow the roots of those who traveled across the seas. Long before the European age of exploration, African navigators and traders crossed the Arabian Sea, connecting the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and the western coast of India. These were skilled sailors, Nubians, Ethiopians, and other East Africans who understood the rhythms of monsoon winds, the tides of trade, and the currents of culture. They didn't come as slaves. They came as masters of navigation, as carriers of knowledge, as emissaries of civilization. Their presence is not an abstraction. It is documented. In the early 16th century, Portuguese travelers recorded that Ethiopians were not only present, but powerful. Armando Cortizo wrote of men who governed the kingdom of Bengal, look upon themselves as Abyssinians, Ethiopians, greatly esteemed. Some even rise to kings and lords. This was not token participation. Africans were central figures in governance, spiritual authority, and military command. They were architects of influence, and their presence shaped the Indian subcontinent at multiple levels. And it was through these Africans that spiritual and philosophical traditions flowed. Many scholars argue that the Naga, described in Dravidian texts as serpent-like, black, dreadlocked, spiritual beings, were not mythical but historical figures. They brought sacred knowledge, ritual practice, and mystical philosophy. They created, preserved, and transmitted Sanskrit. They laid the foundations for Indian religious thought, shaping the earliest forms of what would become Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. Dr. Clyde Winters emphasizes that these African-origin priests and philosophers were more than symbolic figures. Even the legends of India revere the black race that laid the foundation of their civilization. The holiest books of India affirm that enlightenment came from Ethiopia, he writes. In other words, Africa was not a peripheral influence, it was a core contributor to India's spiritual landscape. Consider Shiva again. Shiva is not merely a god of destruction. He is the cosmic dancer, the master of yoga, the source of spiritual transformation. His dark blue or black skin, matted dreadlocks, and symbolic accoutrements, cobra, drum, trident, reflect African iconography. Researchers draw parallels between Shiva and African deities like Aun and Shango. The drum beats of Shiva's Tandava echo the rhythms of Yoruba rituals. The spiritual authority of his dance mirrors Nile Valley priesthoods. The meditative posture, the cosmic power, the ritual gestures, every detail carries African resonance, and Shiva is not isolated. Krishna, often called the Dark One, has midnight blue skin and curly hair. Kali, the fierce mother goddess, is jet black, adorned with a necklace of heads, a motif echoed in African traditions from Dahomey to the Congo. Even Vishnu, the preserver of life, is depicted in some early temples with dark skin, a visual language that reinforces the sacredness of blackness. African influence also reached Buddhist practice in India and Asia. Dr. Vulindle Wabiggo, cited by historian Runako Rashidi, describes the manifestations of Buddha in Asia as black, with woolly hair, resembling priests from Egypt. These African Etontendent priests carried both spiritual and scientific knowledge, meditation techniques, ritual practices, and mystical philosophy, which became integrated into Buddhism, yoga, and Indian monastic systems. The African imprint was not superficial, it was structural, encoded in ritual, philosophy, and pedagogy. And yet, for centuries, colonial historians ignored it. Why? Because acknowledging Africa's influence disrupted the narrative of European superiority. If Africans ruled, taught, and spiritually led in India centuries before European conquest, then history itself needed rewriting. The sacred African presence was gradually whitened or erased in textbooks, temple guides, and art criticism. Yet the physical evidence remained. Black deities in temples, dreadlocked priests depicted in frescoes, philosophical texts tracing lineage to Ethiopia. The continuity is remarkable. Visit small rural temples in India today, and you will find black idols, Krishna, Kali, Shiva, revered as they were centuries ago. The worship is active, the rituals live, the music and dance pulsate with African energy. Pilgrims and devotees often describe an unmistakable power emanating from these black gods, a force rooted in millennia of spiritual practice. This is more than art or anthropology. It is memory. It is lineage. Africa's influence is preserved not only in the tangible, the carved stone, the painted fresco, the written text, but in the intangible, the rituals, chants, and meditative practices. These are living archives of African spiritual civilization, surviving centuries of suppression, marginalization, and rewriting. Even the architecture carries African fingerprints. Temples in Tamil Nadu, carved between the 5th and 12th centuries, feature figures with broad noses, full lips, and textured hair, features consistent with African physiognomy. These images are not decorative exaggeration. They are the conscious encoding of identity, sacred knowledge, and reverence for blackness, the stone, the structure, the iconography. All carry an African signature that has endured the tides of history. So, the question becomes unavoidable. If Africa's spiritual and cultural impact on India was so profound, why is it rarely taught? Why does mainstream history remain silent? Because colonial amnesia erased the memory, because whiteness demanded erasure, because power and control rewrite what is remembered and what is forgotten. But the truth persists. It survives in temple walls, in the faces of deities, in rituals, chants, and philosophy. Blackness was sacred in India. African priests, rulers, and navigators shaped the subcontinent's civilizations. They brought knowledge, governance, spirituality, and artistry. And the gods of India, Krishna, Shiva, Kali, carry the legacy of Africa in their color, their hair, their posture, their spiritual essence. Understanding this is not optional. It is essential to seeing the world as it truly was, connected, multicultural, spiritually intertwined across continents. The next chapter of our story will trace specific African kingdoms, warriors, and scholars who settled in India, revealing how these individuals directly shaped the political, spiritual, and philosophical landscape of the subcontinent. To trace Africa's influence in India, we must follow the stories of the Africans who did not merely arrive, they ruled, advised, and shaped kingdoms. Long before colonial misrepresentations, Ethiopia, Nubia, and other regions of Africa had direct contact with Indian polities. The historical record reveals a surprising truth. Africans were not outsiders. They were central players in governance, warfare, and religious leadership. In Bengal, Gujarat, and the Deccan, African men and women held positions of tremendous power. They were generals, governors, spiritual advisors, and even kings. Their presence is confirmed in European travel accounts, Indian chronicles, and oral histories preserved across centuries. Armando Cortizo, the Portuguese traveler, described Ethiopians in India as Abyssinians, greatly esteemed. Some even rise to kings and lords. After the king, it is to these people the kingdom is obedient. Africans were not marginal figures. They were indispensable to administration, diplomacy, and military strategy. They commanded armies, advised rulers, and mediated disputes. In some regions, African communities controlled entire provinces, ensuring the smooth functioning of commerce, justice, and spiritual life. But governance was not the only domain where African influence thrived. Spiritual and philosophical contributions were equally profound. The Naga, often described as serpent-like black dreadlock beings in ancient Indian texts, were not mere myths. These were African-origin spiritual leaders who carried ritual, meditation, and mystical knowledge from the Nile Valley to the Indian subcontinent. Dr. Clyde Winters emphasizes that the Naga were central to Sanskrit creation, religious philosophy, and early Indian cosmology. Their influence shaped the ethical, philosophical, and mystical frameworks of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. The African imprint is unmistakable in temple art and iconography. Look at South Indian temple carvings in Tamil Nadu, or at the frescoes of Ajanta and Ellora. The figures have broad noses, full lips, textured hair, and dreadlocks. These details are not ornamental. They are deliberate markers of identity. African physiognomy was encoded in sacred spaces, showing reverence for blackness as divine. In many temples, Shiva is depicted with deep blue or black skin, matted locks, a cobra around his neck, and a drum in hand. Krishna appears in midnight blue with textured hair, conveying power, divinity, and ancestral memory. Kali, the mother goddess, is jet black, adorned with necklaces of heads, a motif echoed in African spiritual practice from the Congo and Dahomey. The connection between African spiritual systems and Indian religious traditions is further reinforced by philosophy and ritual. African priests taught meditation techniques, ceremonial law, and sacred geometry that merged seamlessly into Indian yogic and Buddhist practices. Dr. Vulindle Wabiggo notes that manifestations of Buddha in Asia are black with woolly hair, resembling Egyptian or Nile Valley priests. These priests were bearers of profound spiritual knowledge, which later formed the core practices of yoga, meditation, and enlightenment-seeking traditions. Even linguistics carries traces of African influence. Sanskrit, the language of sacred texts, reflects phonetic and syntactic patterns that suggest external influence, possibly from Nile Valley civilizations. Dravidian texts from 500 BC speak of the Naga as real, historical figures who taught ethics, science, and metaphysics. This is not theory. This is historical continuity encoded in literature, preserved in oral memory, and visualized in temple architecture. African migration and maritime trade created the pathways for these interactions. African sailors, traders, and settlers crossed the Arabian Sea long before Europeans arrived. They navigated from the Red Sea, Horn of Africa, and East African ports to the west coast of India, connecting communities, transferring knowledge, and establishing trade networks. These were sophisticated systems of exchange, economic, spiritual, and cultural, that positioned Africa as an integral partner in India's development. Africa's imprint extended to governance structures. Historical records indicate African governors held courtly authority, enforced law, and led armies. In Bengal, Ethiopians were described as knights and advisors to kings. They commanded respect, exercised influence, and maintained autonomy within their spheres. African knowledge systems, political strategy, and martial skills were revered, making these individuals essential pillars of Indian polities. The Arazi spiritual legacy was equally monumental. African priests introduced rituals, ceremonies, and meditative techniques that became integrated into Indian religious practices. They taught methods of attaining transcendence, preserving sacred knowledge, and achieving alignment between body, mind, and cosmos. The influence of African cosmology is apparent in temple orientation, ritual timing, and the symbolic use of colors, materials, and iconography. Blackness itself was sacred, a visual and spiritual reminder of divine power. This sacred blackness survives to this day in India. Small rural temples continue to honor black gods, Krishna, Shiva, Kali. They are revered not as abstract figures but as living embodiments of divine African presence. Devotees describe a palpable energy emanating from these deities, an aura rooted in millennia of ritual practice, meditation, and cultural memory. These temples are living archives, preserving African heritage, spiritual authority, and the cosmological framework brought across continents. Yet mainstream historical narratives largely omit this African presence. Colonial and Eurocentric historians systematically minimized African influence to maintain myths of European superiority. The African rulers, priests, and sages of India were marginalized in written records, their contributions reframed as peripheral, their memory erased from mainstream teaching. But evidence remains in temple carvings, frescoes, chronicles, and oral tradition, a continuous, unbroken lineage of African impact. Recognizing this changes our understanding of history. It forces us to see Africa not as peripheral, but central to global civilization. Africa's influence in India was profound, shaping governance, spirituality, art, and culture. Africans were rulers, priests, philosophers, and cultural architects. Their legacy is embedded in temple stone, sacred texts, ritual practice, and artistic expression. It is alive in India today, still felt, still revered, still powerful. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore specific African dynasties, warrior priests, and philosophers who settled in India, tracing their contributions to governance, spiritual leadership, and cultural transmission. We will see how African rulers were woven into the political, spiritual, and social fabric of the subcontinent, leaving a legacy that survives in architecture, temple iconography, and ritual practice. Africa's presence in India was not incidental. It was structural, woven into the very governance of kingdoms. Consider the Abyssinian, Ethiopian dynasties in Bengal and Gujarat. These were not symbolic titles or ceremonial positions. They were actual rulers with armies, ministers, and bureaucracies. Historical accounts confirm that Africans commanded respect equal to or greater than native-born elites. They acted as generals in battle, oversaw taxation and trade, and even mediated disputes between local rulers. They were, in every sense, integral to the functioning of the state. In the city of Bengal, for example, Africans, referred to in chronicles as Habshis or Abyssinians, were known to exercise judicial authority. They presided over courts, executed laws, and maintained order. The highest officials in many royal courts were African, serving as prime ministers, army commanders, and royal advisors. European travelers like Cortesal marveled at this, writing that the African nobles were obediently feared by local populations, demonstrating influence that extended far beyond ceremonial prestige. This political authority had a cultural and spiritual dimension. The Africans brought with them traditions from the Nile Valley and Horn of Africa, embedding their cosmology into Indian society. They were priest scholars, versed in sacred sciences, astronomy, geometry, and meditation. Their spiritual presence shaped rituals, festivals, and temple practices. Many of the meditative techniques, ritual, dances, and sacred chants seen in India today have African origins, carried over by these early settlers who maintained cultural continuity even while integrating into Indian society. The African impact also extended to architecture. Temples, fortresses, and royal palaces in regions like Gujarat, Bengal, and the Deccan bear symbolic and stylistic hallmarks reminiscent of African aesthetic principles. Stone carvings, iconography, and ritual motifs often depict black-skinned figures, matted hair, and ceremonial dress that mirrors African traditions. Unlike European colonial architecture, which imposed foreign aesthetics, these constructions reflect a fusion of African spiritual symbolism with local Indian forms, creating a hybrid visual language that communicated power, sanctity, and ancestral knowledge. We can also see Africa's influence in martial culture. Africans in India were formidable warriors, trained in both indigenous Indian and African combat techniques. They introduced new strategies, weaponry, and discipline, often commanding elite regiments composed of both African and local soldiers. Their military prowess earned them respect from kings, and their strategic insight influenced the outcome of regional conflicts, demonstrating that African expertise was not limited to ritual or culture, but extended into the practical realities of statecraft and warfare. Religiously, African rulers and priests reinforced the sanctity of blackness as divine. In temples dedicated to Shiva, Krishna, and Kali, we see repeated depictions of black-skinned deities with African features, broad noses, full lips, textured hair. These representations are not abstract, they are encoded with meaning. Blackness signifies power, wisdom, and a connection to ancestral and cosmic forces. The ceremonial dances, drum rhythms, and ritual chants accompanying these images mirror African practices from the Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa, suggesting a deliberate continuity of spiritual philosophy. One striking example is the veneration of Shiva as a black dreadlocked figure holding a drum and a cobra. The drum is not mere decoration. It is a ritual instrument, echoing African percussion traditions used for meditation, communication, and spiritual elevation. The cobra, a symbol of wisdom and power, parallels serpent motifs in African cosmology, including the Naga representations described in Dravidian texts. This is not superficial resemblance. The cultural parallels are deep, specific, and pervasive. Kali, the fearsome mother goddess, is another figure whose African roots are evident. Her jet black skin, dynamic posture, and ritualistic adornments of skulls and bones are echoed in Central and West African spiritual traditions, particularly in Congo and Dahomey. These symbols carry the same meaning: dominion over life and death, the sacred cycle, and the power of transformation. The convergence of iconography suggests direct transmission of spiritual knowledge, rather than coincidental similarity. African influence in India also manifests linguistically. Ancient texts preserve names, titles, and ceremonial vocabulary traceable to Afro-Asiatic languages. The Sanskrit word for Naga, often associated with serpent or divine beings, corresponds to African spiritual lineages. Oral traditions reinforce this, recounting the arrival of black sages who instructed local communities in cosmology, ethics, and sacred law. These teachings were not temporary. They became embedded in philosophical systems that persist in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism today. Even in trade and economic life, Africans left a mark. Maritime networks connecting East Africa to India were thriving centuries before the European age of exploration. African traders brought goods, religious artifacts, and spiritual knowledge, establishing ports and settlements along the western coast of India. This created a sustained African presence, not as outsiders but as respected members of society who contributed to wealth, security, and cultural enrichment. Education was another avenue of African influence. Africans in India were patrons of learning and philosophy. They maintained libraries, trained students in religious texts, and facilitated the transfer of knowledge from Nile Valley civilizations. Their contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and ethical philosophy were absorbed into Indian systems, demonstrating a sophisticated, reciprocal exchange of intellectual capital. This historical reality challenges the dominant narratives that portray Africa as peripheral or solely enslaved. Africans were architects of civilization in India, shaping politics, spirituality, art, and scholarship. Their impact is tangible, recorded in architecture, temple iconography, chronicles, and oral memory. Blackness was revered, integrated, and celebrated, not erased or marginalized. Understanding this shifts our perspective. Africa was not merely a source of labor or exoticized wisdom. It was a central contributor to Indian civilization. Africans ruled, taught, created, and guided spiritual life. Their presence is encoded in stone, literature, and ritual, a living testimony that challenges simplified histories and colonial erasures. The next chapter will explore the interconnections between African religious practices, Indian temple rituals, and the philosophical systems that emerge from this cross-continental exchange. We will trace the threads of meditation, worship, and cosmic knowledge from the Nile to the Indus, revealing how these connections shape the spiritual landscape of Asia and preserve the African legacy in enduring ways. The spiritual imprint of Africans in India extends far beyond iconography. It is embedded in the very practices that define Indian sacred life. Yoga, meditation, and ritual observances carry fingerprints of Nile Valley and Horn of Africa traditions. This is not speculative. Careful study of ancient texts, iconography, and temple practices reveal structural similarities with African priestly systems. The rhythms, postures, and chants associated with yoga and meditation parallel Egyptian, Ethiopian, and Nubian ceremonial practices. In these traditions, the body is a vessel of cosmic energy, the breath a bridge to spiritual realms, and the drum or mantra a tool for transformation, concepts also central to African spirituality. Consider the temple dance. In South India, priests and priestesses perform intricate, repetitive movements synchronized with percussion and ritual songs. These dances are not decorative. They are spiritual exercises designed to align the human body with cosmic forces. This mirrors West African and Nile Valley ritual dance, where movement and music serve as conduits for divine energy. The postures, gestures, and sequences are strikingly similar, suggesting a preserved methodology that crossed oceans and centuries. Even the most basic elements, matted hair, sacred markings, and body paint, carry meaning. The dreadlocks of Shiva, for example, are more than an aesthetic choice. They signify spiritual power, discipline, and lineage. In African traditions, hair often functions in the same symbolic capacity, marking status, spiritual mastery, or ancestral connection. These shared symbolic elements indicate a transmission of ritual literacy, a coded spiritual language that survives in practice even when written histories fail to acknowledge it. Chanting is another conduit for African influence. In both African and Indian rituals, vocalizations are not merely recitations, they are vibrational instruments intended to harmonize human consciousness with cosmic order. Mantras, like those preserved in Sanskrit and Vedic texts, often mirror tonal patterns found in African ritual songs. These patterns are not coincidental. They reflect a shared understanding of sound as a vehicle for spiritual transformation, preserved across continents by African priests who traveled and settled in India. Temples themselves serve as living textbooks of African influence. The orientation of sanctuaries, the layout of altars, the sequence of entryways and ritual courtyards all show echoes of Nile Valley spiritual architecture. African priests in India may have introduced axial designs, sacred geometries, and ceremonial sequences that mirror their homeland. These designs are functional, not decorative. They regulate ritual, mark sacred time, and encode spiritual knowledge. Even the portrayal of the divine body reflects African influence. Gods depicted in dark blue or black with exaggerated features, broad noses, full lips, textured hair, mirror African physiognomy. These representations are intentional, not incidental. In the visual language of ritual, they encode ancestry, power, and the sacredness of blackness. The deliberate choice to render gods in African features reinforces the broader theological message. Divinity is not foreign to Africa, it is African. The transmission of African spiritual knowledge into Indian thought also shows up in philosophical texts. The Naga, described in Dravidian literature as serpent beings, are historically linked to Black African sages who introduced cosmology, astronomy, and metaphysical concepts to Indian societies. These sages were credited with the creation of Sanskrit and the codification of sacred law. Their influence permeates Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain texts, suggesting that foundational Indian philosophy cannot be fully understood without acknowledging African contributions. Moreover, Africa's imprint in India was not passive or symbolic, it was dynamic. African priests, scholars, and rulers actively shaped governance, education, and religious life. The presence of Africans in positions of authority allowed for cross-cultural synthesis. Ritual, law, and philosophy were influenced by African norms, yet adapted to the Indian environment. This hybridization created a spiritual ecosystem where African and Indian traditions reinforced and amplified each other. Trade networks facilitated this exchange. Long before the Portuguese age of exploration, African seafarers, especially from the Horn of Africa and Nubia, navigated the Arabian Sea. Ports along the western Indian coast became hubs of African influence, where traders, soldiers, and priests settled, bringing their cultural practices with them. This was not marginal presence, it was central. Africans controlled key maritime routes, mediated commerce, and ensured that cultural transmission was sustained, creating enduring legacies in ritual, art, and governance. Even culinary and medicinal practices reflect African integration. Ritual diets, fasting protocols, and herbal medicines found in Indian temples often mirror African counterparts, suggesting shared knowledge systems in health, diet, and spiritual hygiene. African settlers carried both practical and sacred knowledge, preserving ancestral wisdom in Nautital, a new land, while contributing to the broader Indian civilizational matrix. The reverence for blackness in India, as documented by Marco Polo and later European observers, was reinforced by ritual, art, and philosophy. Blackness was divine, a visible symbol of spiritual authority and cosmic alignment. This reverence stands in sharp contrast to later European colonial narratives that attempted to erase African contributions, whiten gods, and suppress historical memory. The African presence in India, fully integrated and respected, challenges any assumption that blackness has historically been marginalized. The continuity of African spiritual traditions in India is evident even today. Rural temples still maintain black idols of Krishna, Shiva, and Kali. Priests perform rituals and chants that preserve ancient rhythms and sequences. Festivals, dance, and meditation practices retain African structures and intentions. The physical and spiritual legacy of African influence endures, a living testament to centuries of interaction, reverence, and synthesis. Understanding these connections is essential not only for historical accuracy, but for spiritual and cultural reclamation. Recognizing the African roots of Indian religious practices and iconography allows us to see global civilization not as isolated, but interconnected. Africa's contributions were central, not peripheral. Spiritual, political, and intellectual threads linking continents and shaping the sacred landscape of Asia. In the next chapter, we will examine specific African lineages in Indian royal courts, their ceremonial and political influence, and the living traditions in urban and rural temples today, tracing how African identity shaped governance, spirituality, and cultural memory in India across centuries. Africa's influence in India was not limited to temples or spiritual practices. It extended into the highest seats of power. Across the subcontinent, Africans were warriors, governors, ministers, and even kings, shaping the political and cultural landscape of India for centuries. Historical records, European travelers' accounts, and local chronicles confirm their prominent roles. This is not peripheral history, it is central. Africans were not footnotes. They were architects of policy, military strategy, and governance. In Bengal, for example, African soldiers, often referred to as Habshis or Abyssinians, were integral to court life. They served as generals, administrators, and royal advisors. Armando Cortizo, a Portuguese traveler in the early 16th century, observed, "The people who govern the kingdom, Bengal, are Abyssinians. These men are looked upon as knights. They are greatly esteemed. The chief among them are eunuchs, and these come to be kings and great lords in the kingdom." Africans were not tolerated. They were respected, feared, and empowered. Their influence extended into diplomacy, military campaigns, and the enforcement of law, and their spiritual authority often complemented their political power. The Habshis brought not only leadership skills but also sacred knowledge, marrying administrative acumen with spiritual wisdom. In many cases, their African spiritual practices were integrated into Indian courts. Sacred rituals, religious observances, and ceremonial practices bore unmistakable African hallmarks. Priests and advisors from Africa introduced ritual timing, sacred geometry in palace layouts, and ceremonial codes that echoed Nile Valley traditions. These systems were not decorative, they were functional, ensuring cosmic alignment, political stability, and social cohesion. In Gujarat and the Deccan, African rulers and military commanders similarly left their mark. The Siddhis, descendants of East African settlers, were instrumental in coastal defense, trade regulation, and even founding urban centers. These communities retained African spiritual practices while adapting to Indian cultural frameworks. They maintained sacred drumming traditions, ritual dance, and ceremonial markings that mirrored African priestly practices, reinforcing their ancestral identity. Their presence ensured that African contributions to Indian governance and spirituality were neither symbolic nor fleeting. They were structural and enduring. Even beyond the courts, African influence permeated local communities. Coastal settlements often had African priests and scholars who served as mediators, spiritual guides, and educators. They taught meditation, astronomy, mathematics, and sacred philosophy, blending African and Indian knowledge systems. Ritual festivals, temple ceremonies, and sacred theater in these regions often reflected hybrid practices: African rhythms combined with Indian melodies, African postures with Sanskritized gestures. This synthesis created a living, breathing culture that honored African heritage while flourishing within Indian civilization. The African imprint is particularly visible in the iconography of Indian deities. Krishna, Shiva, and Kali are not abstract figures. They are African in physiognomy, posture, and expression. The deep blue and black hues of their skin, textured hair, and broad features are consistent across centuries and regions. In temples, these deities are often accompanied by ritual instruments, drums, horns, and bells that closely resemble African sacred implements. The choreography of priests and devotees during festivals mirrors African ceremonial sequences, suggesting continuity rather than coincidence. Moreover, African philosophical thought influenced Indian metaphysics. The Naga, often depicted as serpent beings in Dravidian literature, are historically connected to Black African sages who introduced cosmological and metaphysical knowledge. Concepts of cyclical time, cosmic order, and spiritual liberation in Indian philosophy bear striking resemblance to African thought systems, particularly those preserved by Nile Valley and Ethiopian priesthoods. These ideas informed Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, embedding African intellectual contributions deep within the subcontinent's spiritual DNA. African spiritual authority also extended into education. Scholars and priests from Ethiopia, Nubia, and East Africa often led centers of learning, teaching philosophy, astronomy, and ritual practice. Manuscripts indicate that these teachers were highly regarded, their guidance sought by Indian elites, and their rituals incorporated into state ceremonies. African intellectuals were thus not merely outsiders, they were architects of knowledge, shaping the intellectual and spiritual development of Indian societies. The presence of Africans in India was also preserved in European observation. Marco Polo, Armando Cortizo, and other travelers noted the respect afforded to dark-skinned people, and the European records emphasized their positions of authority. These accounts, often dismissed by colonial historians, serve as crucial evidence of African power, prestige, and spiritual leadership in South and Southeast Asia. Africans were fully integrated into Indian political, social, and religious life, not as marginal figures, but as central actors whose authority shaped kingdoms and communities. Importantly, the African presence in India challenges modern assumptions about diaspora and migration. Africans did not arrive as enslaved or subjugated peoples. They arrived as traders, warriors, scholars, and rulers. Their migration was proactive, strategic, and influential, predating the European age of exploration. They carried not only material skills but also spiritual knowledge, embedding African cosmology and sacred practice into the Indian subcontinent. This demonstrates that African civilization was globally mobile, intellectually dynamic, and spiritually profound long before colonial narratives sought to marginalize it. As we move forward, it is crucial to understand that these African rulers, scholars, and priests did more than survive. They thrived. They influenced ritual, philosophy, governance, and art in India in ways that continue to echo today. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It is etched in temple walls, preserved in ceremonial practice and alive in the spiritual rhythms that guide contemporary India. In the next chapter, we will examine specific African contributions to temple architecture, ritual music, and ceremonial festivals, revealing how African design, rhythm, and symbolism continue to shape Indian sacred spaces and practices even in the present day. The architecture of Indian temples tells a story that textbooks rarely acknowledge. Step into a temple in Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, and you immediately see African influence etched into stone. Look closely at the columns, the carvings, the gates, and the spires. The figures dancing across friezes, their hair, their posture, their expressions, mirror African iconography found along the Nile in Ethiopia and across West Africa. These are not stylistic coincidences. They are the fingerprints of a global spiritual network with Africa at its center. Take the intricate carvings at the Brihadiswarar temple in Thanjavur. The Apsaras, guardian deities, and attendant figures have full lips, broad noses, and textured hair. Some figures are depicted in ritual poses resembling African ceremonial dances, captured in relief on granite walls. The rhythmic flow of the sculptures, the geometry of the space, and even the proportions of the sanctum echo African design principles. Symmetry tied to cosmic cycles, alignment with celestial bodies, and use of sacred numbers to generate spiritual harmony. Drums, bells, and other instruments play a central role in Indian temple ritual. Yet, the shape, rhythm, and function of these instruments often reflect African traditions. The mridangam, damaru, and ghatam may appear purely Indian, but their sonic patterns resonate with African drumming, techniques used in ceremonial and spiritual contexts. Devotees and priests move in patterns that resemble African dance formations, a choreography that integrates rhythm, body, and cosmic awareness. In effect, worship becomes a living transmission of African spiritual practice, adapted to Indian theology. Even the temple festivals reveal African continuity. During processions, priests and devotees carry sacred images through the streets, chanting, drumming, and dancing. The movement of the body, the cadence of the voice, and the communal energy mirror rituals seen in Yoruba, Akan, and Fon ceremonies. Fire, water, and incense play crucial roles, symbolizing purification, cosmic order, and ancestral connection, core principles shared across African and Indian spiritual systems. These practices are more than performative. They are sacred reenactments of African ritual philosophy encoded into Indian religious life. The iconography of deities themselves is compelling. Krishna, Shiva, and Kali are portrayed as dark-skinned, textured-haired, and physically African in form. Their poses, gestures, and ritual tools correspond to African metaphysical concepts. Shiva's damaru, drum, is not just musical. It embodies cosmic vibration, a principle mirrored in African sacred drum traditions. Kali's necklace of skulls echoes ancestor veneration practices, reminding devotees of mortality, power, and spiritual continuity. The correlation is so precise that it cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. African spiritual mathematics also influence temple design. Alignment with cardinal directions, proportionality, and sacred geometry, commonly attributed to Indian ingenuity, often reflect African cosmology. The Egyptian and Ethiopian influence is particularly clear in the use of nested squares, concentric circles, and axis mundi concepts that anchor sacred space. These mathematical principles were not decorative, they were functional. They encoded spiritual law, cosmic order, and ritual sequence into the very stones of the temple. Pilgrimage routes further illustrate African impact. Many sacred paths follow patterns consistent with African sacred geography, integrating water, elevation, and cardinal orientation. Rivers, ponds, and natural features within temple compounds are not random. They correspond to ritual principles that prioritize purification, initiation, and spiritual alignment. In West African traditions, water is a medium for communication with ancestors and spirits. In India, water bodies serve a similar function in temple ritual. The continuity is undeniable. Sanskrit itself, often cited as uniquely Indian, bears linguistic traces of African influence. The Naga and Abyssinian presence in India brought oral traditions, sacred chants, and phonetic practices that shaped regional pronunciation and ceremonial recitation. Sacred mantras retain African cadence and tone, preserving vocal patterns that align with ancestral memory. The chanting of Krishna bhajans, Shiva stotras, and Vedic hymns carries a resonance that mirrors African ritual intonation, connecting sound to spirit, body, and cosmos. Even mundane aspects of temple life, the patterns of priestly robes, the colors of ceremonial garlands, and the sequence of offerings reflect African aesthetics and symbolic reasoning. Black, red, and gold dominate sacred palettes, colors that in African spiritual systems denote fertility, vitality, ancestral connection, and divine power. The sequence of offerings, which includes water, grains, and symbolic items, aligns with African ritual logic, establishing harmony between human, divine, and natural realms. Textual records further confirm these intersections. Vedic texts, Dravidian literature, and Buddhist chronicles describe beings with African physical features, often using terms like Naga to signify divine authority or spiritual mastery. These references are more than myth. They encode historical memory, indicating that African presence, influence, and spiritual authority were recognized and integrated into Indian thought. In essence, Indian temples, festivals, chants, and rituals are repositories of African knowledge, encoded in architecture, sound, and ceremony. Africans shaped the metaphysical framework, provided spiritual leadership, and guided devotional practice. The African imprint is not subtle. It is visible, audible, and functional, embedded in every stone, every drumbeat, and every chant. Yet, mainstream historical narratives have obscured these truths. Colonial scholarship deliberately minimized African presence, presenting Indian civilization as insular and uniquely South Asian. The suppression of African contributions to India mirrors broader patterns of erasure across global history. Recognizing African influence is not revisionism, it is restoration, acknowledging the connections that shaped world culture. In the next chapter, we will explore how African spiritual concepts in India influence Buddhism, yoga, and meditation, tracing philosophical, metaphysical, and practical links from the Nile to the Indus. We will uncover how African thought shaped practices still followed by millions worldwide today. To understand the full scope of African influence in India, we must move beyond temple walls and visual iconography and examine philosophy, meditation, and spiritual practice. Ancient India developed vast systems of thought, yoga, tantra, meditation, and even early Buddhist schools. But many of these practices carry unmistakable African fingerprints. This is not speculation. It is evident when you examine ritual structure, meditation techniques, cosmology, and the symbolic language embedded in sacred texts. Start with yoga. Globally, yoga is celebrated as an Indian contribution to humanity, often stripped of its historical context. Yet the roots of yoga, the posture, breathwork, and energetic channels, mirror African initiation practices and shamanic disciplines. Scholars such as Dr. Vulindle Wabiggo have traced these methods to Egyptian and Ethiopian priesthoods that migrated eastward across the Indian Ocean. These priesthoods carried a deep understanding of the body as an instrument for spiritual power, using breath, rhythm, and posture to align with cosmic forces. The African origin of these techniques explains why many yoga postures mimic animal forms, energy flow patterns, and meditative gestures also found in African spiritual systems. Consider the concept of prana, the life force in yoga, and compare it to African notions of vital energy, what the Yoruba call ace or the Akan sunsum. Both systems recognize that energy flows through the human body, linking physical, spiritual, and cosmic realms. The practice of controlling and channeling this energy is central to enlightenment and spiritual mastery. Ancient Africans developed these techniques over millennia, teaching that the body is not just flesh, it is a temple, a conduit, a reflection of the divine. These teachings traveled with African priests and migrants, integrating seamlessly into Indian philosophy. Meditation provides another clear point of convergence. The seated postures, breath awareness, and focus on the third eye or crown chakra bear remarkable similarity to Egyptian meditative traditions. African mystics taught that meditation was not passive. It was a tool for accessing higher consciousness, ancestral knowledge, and cosmic alignment. In India, Buddhist meditation methods emphasize insight, vipassana, concentration, samatha, and the union of body and mind, echoing the practices carried by African spiritual leaders. The precision, discipline, and transformative intention behind these methods indicate a shared intellectual and spiritual lineage. Tantra, often sensationalized in modern media, is yet another area where African spiritual influence is evident. Contrary to the misrepresentations, Tantra is not primarily about sexuality. It is a system of ritual, energy work, and transformation. The African root of Tantra emerges in ritualistic practices involving fire, water, chanting, sacred geometry, and symbolic items, all designed to create energetic resonance with the cosmos. African shamans, priests, and kings use these techniques for initiation, healing, and spiritual authority. When translated into Indian contexts, these practices retain their core principles, forming a bridge between African ritual science and Indian spiritual philosophy. Buddhism, too, bears the mark of African connection. Early Buddhist texts describe teachers, monks, and enlightened figures with dark skin and curly hair. According to scholars who study Afrocentric influences in Asia, these representations are not decorative. They indicate a historical reality of African teachers and migrants participating in the development of Buddhist schools. The symbolic depictions of monks seated in meditation under trees, with ritual tools in hand and in rhythmic chant, are strikingly similar to African monastic traditions observed along the Nile and in Nubia. Even the stories of enlightenment, rebirth, and mastery over the mind align with African mystical frameworks, emphasizing the continuity of consciousness and spiritual evolution. The influence of African metaphysics extends to Indian cosmology and sacred numerology. Consider the pervasive use of numbers like 108, 7, 3, and 12 in ritual, architecture, and scripture. These are not arbitrary. African cultures, especially in Nile Valley civilizations, assign symbolic and functional meanings to numbers, integrating them into calendars, rituals, and sacred geometry. Temples, mandalas, and ritual patterns in India employ these same numerical systems, suggesting that African numerology underpins significant aspects of Indian spiritual design. Even Sanskrit texts, often portrayed as exclusively Indian, preserve linguistic echoes of African oral tradition. The rhythm, tone, and phonetic structure of mantras reveal African patterns of intonation and memorization. These linguistic features were not incidental. They shaped meditation, ritual recitation, and spiritual focus. By chanting in Sanskrit with African cadences, practitioners align themselves with a knowledge system that spans continents, centuries, and civilizations. Moreover, African migration to India was not a marginal phenomenon. Across the Indian Ocean, Nubians, Ethiopians, and East Africans traveled as navigators, traders, and spiritual emissaries. They held positions of authority in kingdoms such as Bengal, Gujarat, and the Deccan. They were not outsiders. They were integrated into society as warriors, governors, priests, and scholars. Their spiritual influence permeated Indian religious life, shaping philosophy, ritual, and sacred art. This integration explains why Indian gods remain black, why rituals retain African rhythm, and why sacred architecture mirrors African cosmology. It also clarifies why mainstream histories obscure these connections. Colonial scholarship prioritized erasing African contributions to emphasize European primacy. What was once visible became Indian, local, or native, while the African origins were buried beneath centuries of historiographical erasure. Today, these truths are resurfacing. Afrocentric scholars, historians, and spiritual researchers are uncovering the African roots of Indian philosophy, meditation, yoga, and ritual practice. When we trace the lineage from Nile Valley priesthoods to Indian temples and monastic schools, we see a continuous thread. Blackness was not just represented, it was revered. Spiritual power, cosmic knowledge, and enlightenment were associated with African features. These sacred teachings traveled oceans, survived empires, and continue to inform human spirituality. In the next chapter, we will explore specific African lineages in India, tracing families, rulers, and spiritual orders that maintained African identity, transmitted sacred knowledge, and influenced culture from royal courts to rural shrines. We will reveal historical documents, eyewitness accounts, and surviving traditions that prove the depth of Africa's imprint on India's spiritual landscape. To fully grasp Africa's imprint on India, we must turn to those who embodied power, knowledge, and spiritual authority, the African rulers, priests, and warriors who settled across the subcontinent. These were not minor figures. They were central to governance, religious life, and cultural innovation. Their presence is documented in multiple European travelogues, administrative records, and local Indian chronicles, which consistently refer to dark-skinned leaders wielding influence over entire kingdoms. Take Bengal, for instance. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese traveler Armando Cortesão observed that the people who govern the kingdom are Abyssinians, Ethiopians. They are greatly esteemed and wait on the kings in their apartments. The chief among them are eunuchs, and these come to be kings and great lords in the kingdom. After the king, it is to this people that the kingdom is obedient from fear. Cortesão's words reveal a social hierarchy where African leaders were not only accepted but revered and feared, a position of immense power and prestige. But Africans in India were not confined to political spheres. They were deeply integrated into spiritual life. Priests of African descent oversaw temple rituals, guided meditation practices, and preserved sacred knowledge. Their presence influenced the design of temples, the rhythm of chants, and the symbolic content of frescoes and sculptures. They were the living conduits of a transcontinental spiritual tradition linking the Nile Valley with the Indian subcontinent. In some shrines, their lineage continues to this day, with hereditary priests maintaining African ritual patterns that predate the colonial era. In Gujarat and the Deccan, African leaders similarly held positions of authority, bridging local populations and royal households. These men and women were often tasked with guarding sacred texts, advising rulers, and conducting complex ceremonies aligned with cosmic calendars. Their African heritage was not hidden. It was celebrated. Festivals, temple rituals, and royal ceremonies often depicted black-skinned deities, reflecting the society's recognition of Africa's spiritual authority. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the realm of iconography. Across India, black deities, Shiva, Krishna, Kali, appear not only in grand temples but also in small rural shrines. They are consistently depicted with features resonant of African ancestry: dreadlocked or curly hair, broad noses, full lips, and dark skin. These representations are never accidental. They reflect a conscious memory preserved across centuries. Locals continue to paint, carve, and ritualize these figures, demonstrating that African influence is not merely historical, it is living. This influence extends to the philosophy underlying religious practice. Concepts of balance, duality, and cosmic harmony, central to Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, echo African cosmologies from the Nile and Horn of Africa. The African priesthoods understood the universe as a network of energies, cycles, and ancestral connections, concepts that were mirrored in Indian thought systems. Meditation, mantra, and ritual were tools to align the human body and mind with these universal forces, a knowledge carried by Africans into India and codified over centuries in temples, texts, and oral tradition. The movement of Africans to India was facilitated by maritime trade and migration long before European colonial expansion. Navigators, merchants, and scholars crossed the Arabian Sea, connecting the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean. These travelers were often invited into royals, courts as advisors, military leaders, and spiritual guides. They were the conduits of a broader Afro-Asian network that transmitted knowledge, religion, and culture across continents. This challenges the simplistic narrative that Africa's influence in Asia was marginal or purely incidental. It was deliberate, documented, and profound. Take the example of the Ethiopian influence on Sanskrit literature. Certain texts contain linguistic structures and symbolism strongly reminiscent of African oral traditions. The recitation style, tonal patterns, and mnemonic devices were likely preserved by African priests who integrated their knowledge into Indian pedagogical methods. The result is a spiritual education system in India that, while codified locally, carries the fingerprints of African epistemology, teaching students to perceive energy, ritual, and morality as intertwined. Even festivals, songs, and ritual dances provide evidence of African presence. The percussive rhythms of drumming, call and response chants, and sacred movement patterns align closely with African ceremonial traditions. The symbolism of masks, body paint, and sacred geometry further highlights a deliberate African imprint. These practices were transmitted across generations, blending with local Indian forms while retaining their essential African character. Visitors to India in the 15th and 16th centuries frequently remarked on these cultural resonances, noting that black priests, warriors, and rulers embodied a spiritual authority unmatched by their non-African counterparts. The spiritual legacy of African migrants in India is particularly visible in temple management. Ritual calendars, purification rites, and ceremonial hierarchies often bear striking resemblance to African models. Priests trained in these traditions emphasize the sanctity of blackness, the power of ancestral memory, and the necessity of ritual discipline. These are not superficial adoptions. They are the continuation of a coherent African worldview, integrated seamlessly into Indian society. And yet, mainstream historical narratives have long silenced this story. Colonial and post-colonial historians minimized African presence, emphasizing European or local Indian achievement. Images of black deities were often reinterpreted, painted over, or dismissed as stylistic quirks. Textual references to African rulers and priests were either ignored or misattributed. This erasure was deliberate, part of a broader effort to sanitize global history and marginalize African contributions. Today, the evidence is being rediscovered. Scholars, researchers, and Afrocentric historians are piecing together archives, travelogues, temple records, and oral histories. The picture that emerges is undeniable. African migrants shaped India's spiritual, political, and cultural life in profound ways. Their influence is visible not only in temples and texts, but in the rhythm, ritual, and philosophy that continues to define Indian civilization. In the next chunk, we will examine the direct connections between African maritime networks and the construction of sacred sites, tracing how knowledge, ritual, and spiritual authority traveled across oceans to leave an indelible mark on Indian religious landscapes. To understand the full magnitude of Africa's imprint on India, we must follow the paths that carried people, knowledge, and ritual across the ocean. These were not accidental journeys. They were deliberate, ancient networks of trade, migration, and spiritual exchange. African navigators sailed the Arabian Sea, crossing centuries-old maritime routes connecting the Red Sea, East Africa, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian subcontinent. They carried more than goods. They carried priests, scribes, scholars, and ritual experts. They carried the living pulse of Africa's spiritual intelligence, embedding it into temples, schools, and royal courts across India. These African emissaries did not arrive as outsiders. They became authorities. Kings in Bengal, Gujarat, and the Deccan appointed them as advisors, generals, and spiritual overseers. They were the architects of ritual, the keepers of sacred law, the interpreters of cosmic order. In shrines and temples, they curated knowledge systems rooted in African cosmology, ancestral veneration, cycles of energy, meditation, and moral discipline. The black-skinned deities carved in stone, painted in frescoes, and worshipped in rural sanctuaries were reflections of these African priestess' vision, their memory encoded in every ritual gesture, every chant, every sacred drumbeat. The temples themselves tell the story. Step into a shrine in Tamil Nadu or gaze upon the carvings at Ellora. You see African features in Shiva's dreadlocks, Kali's fierce visage, Krishna's midnight blue skin. The proportions, the hair texture, the facial structure, they are deliberate. They are memory preserved in stone, and yet it is not just the gods that carry this heritage. The architectural layouts, the ritual calendars, the sequences of purification and ceremony, these are African in logic and intention. The temples were living classrooms of African cosmology, teaching harmony, duality, and connection between human and divine. Even the festivals, dances, and musical traditions reveal African fingerprints. The rhythmic drumming, the call and response chants, the ceremonial gestures, they mirror rituals from Congo, Dahomey, and the Nile Valley. African priests trained Indian initiates to honor ancestral memory, to treat blackness as sacred, to perceive energy as a living network connecting humans, deities, and the cosmos. The African worldview was not an addition to Indian culture, it was integrated, celebrated, and revered. European travelers documented it. Portuguese observers in the 16th century marveled at the prominence of Africans in governance and spiritual life. They recorded black priests who conducted ceremonies with authority, African warriors who protected sacred sites, and rulers whose dissent was respected across entire kingdoms. These were Africans embedded in power, culture, and religion, not marginal figures at the edge of history, but central actors in the shaping of Indian civilization. And yet, the colonial erasure began. As European empires expanded, history was rewritten. Black priests, rulers, and deities were whitewashed, renamed, or dismissed as curiosities. Temples were modernized with European aesthetic ideals. African lineage and spiritual authority were obscured. Texts mentioning Ethiopians or Naga leaders were buried in archives, misattributed, or erased entirely. The deliberate silencing was systematic. Black influence was hidden in plain sight. But these truths cannot be fully buried. Stones don't lie. Frescoes don't forget. Oral traditions endure. Across rural India, small shrines still preserve black deities. Priests continue to perform rituals exactly as their African predecessors taught. Every chant, every drumbeat, every ceremonial alignment with cosmic calendars carries the memory of African spiritual authority. The rhythm of Africa continues to pulse in India's religious heart. What does this mean for us today? It means that history, as we were taught, it is incomplete. Africa was not just a distant continent, it was a central, formative force in the spiritual, cultural, and political life of one of the world's greatest civilizations. The gods of India, the philosophy of temples, the knowledge of meditation, yoga, and cosmic alignment, they all carry African fingerprints. This is not metaphor. This is living history. This is Africa's eternal legacy woven into the fabric of Asia. And the most remarkable part, it was never meant to be forgotten. The memory of Africa's sacred contribution was deliberately maintained even when others tried to erase it. The gods remember, the priests remember, the rituals remember. India carries Africa in its stones, in its chants, in its sacred rhythms. So when you walk through a temple in India and see a black Shiva, a black Krishna, a black Kali, understand what you are witnessing. You are looking at the culmination of centuries of African influence preserved against erasure. You are witnessing history that colonial textbooks tried to hide. You are seeing proof that Africa's spiritual, cultural, and intellectual contributions shaped the world far beyond its borders. Africa's imprint is alive, radiant, and undeniable. It is in the rhythms of ritual, the posture of gods, the architecture of temples, the philosophy of sacred practice. It is the heartbeat connecting continents, the invisible thread linking the Nile Valley to the Ganges. This is the story of Africa's sacred legacy, a story of rulers, priests, and warriors who carried the soul of a continent across oceans, embedding it in the divine and human life of India. And here is the final truth. Africa is not peripheral to world history. It is central. Africa is not absent from spiritual traditions across the globe. It is foundational. And the black gods of India, Shiva, Krishna, Kali, stand as living monuments to Africa's eternal influence. They are reminders, in stone, in ritual, in song, that the sacred in many parts of the world has always worn African skin. So remember this: when you see a black deity in India, you are not seeing a local curiosity. You are seeing Africa immortalized. You are seeing a civilization's reverence for blackness, a continent's spiritual wisdom preserved through time, a history erased but never gone. Africa's gods are still walking the world, still dancing through temples, still guiding the hands and hearts of those who worship. And now, with truth in hand, we can honor them, reclaim that history, and let the world finally see what Africa has always known, that the divine, the powerful, and the eternal have always been black.